Aloha, listeners and viewers. Welcome to Intermission, a conversation series between artists. Intermission is the Hawaii Chamber Music Festival's exclusive online channel with Broadcast Hawaii. I'm your host, festival founder Chris Yick, and today we have a special guest conductor with us, Ming Luke. So Ming wears a lot of hats, and how I met Ming was about 2 years ago, when I guess the second year of Blackburn's Music Academy in Napa Valley was happening. Ming is sort of like the founder and works together with all the board and whatnot, and we kept in close contact. And since then, I think we connect really well, and there's a lot of entrepreneurial things. And he's a fantastic conductor. I love playing under him. So yeah, Ming, how are you doing? Aloha.
Aloha. Yeah, it's great. I wish I was in Hawaii right now.
Yeah. So where are you located right now, actually?
In California, in San Francisco Bay Area, in Silicon Valley and Mountain View. But
Oh,
my
awesome.
father grew up in Hawaii, and so we go back all the time. And I was actually supposed to go back before COVID hit, and so I'm missing it. Debating spending the 2 weeks in quarantine just to hang out.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, let's get right to it. The first question I always ask with every artist involved is, how has COVID affected your career at the moment? It's just like it seems so surreal. We were performing, conducting, doing all these things, and all of a sudden March came and boom, it's all gone.
Yeah,
Cancellation after
exactly.
cancellation.
March 13th, I remember it specifically because it was the opening of Midsummer Night's Dream with San
Mhm.
Francisco Ballet. And I worked with San Francisco Ballet. It was one of the organizations throughout the year. And San Francisco, as many people might know, was one of the first places to shut down
Sure.
venues for
Sure.
large ensemble, for large group gatherings.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so the War Memorial, where the San Francisco Ballet performs, which we share with the Opera House, is actually owned by the city.
yeah.
And so the city directly shut down the venue following the first performance.
Wow.
So, immediately from that point on, we knew that things were going to be difficult.
For
And
sure.
I'm fortunate to work with a lot of different groups. I'm the principal conductor in Nashville
Hmm.
with Nashville Ballet. I have a chorus in Berkeley. I work with Berkeley Symphony. I
Hmm.
work with San Francisco Symphony as a
Sure.
cover. And so every single one of them over time, treated their concerts slightly differently.
Yeah.
So, for instance, Berkeley Community Chorus and Orchestra spent about suspended rehearsals, but it took actually maybe a month for them to actually cancel their concert series, and they're starting debates on what to do next year and how to change things to be
Yeah.
have online rehearsals.
Hmm.
The Merced Symphony is planning its season next year because it actually has a very large hall and feels like they might be able to spread out
Sure.
uh, the audience as well as the orchestra. So
Hmm.
currently, they are not postponing or canceling their fall season in 2020, which is very different. San Francisco Symphony, was canceling week by week as the shelter in place was inched further and further along,
Hmm.
and so they, were taking a much more day by day approach.
Yeah.
And so I think, for all of us, performances obviously have canceled and there's big financial impact,
Yeah,
but I
definitely.
think the emotional toll is actually more significant. Not, we have based our lives around trying to communicate, trying to
Sure.
connect
Sure.
and collaborate with other musicians, and to not be able to do that and to not be able to have that venue in which to, like a literal venue to be able to make music and connect with other people is really difficult. And now, obviously, most of the summer activities have been canceled, but most people are thinking about the fall and the spring of next
Hmm.
year.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so, one organization, Berkeley Symphony, for instance, is debating their education. I do their education programs, whether they can do any education programs for the entirety of next year, and what it means to do something virtually.
Yeah.
There's a lot of yeah, I think it's literally day by day where we're trying to make
For sure,
plans.
for sure. Well, I think like all professions have definitely gotten hit from this COVID thing, but music in particular, we're definitely improvising as we go. But as you mentioned, in some ways, this kind of puts musicians homeless artistically, right? It's just like you mentioned, like the venues, the calls. It's just those were our ways of not only our jobs, but just our way of communicating with the community. And now it seems like that has just sort of been removed with all this happening. So I guess the question is, how do you think this will all pan out afterwards? I mean, some people compare this experience even worse than like 9/11, for example. What are your thoughts on how do you think a post-COVID music world will look like?
Yeah, I think so. I agree with that because 9/11 was an emotional hit for all of us,
Sure.
and it was getting back into our routines
Hmm.
that actually helped us get back. And this is exactly the opposite because we want to be able to get back into our routines, but we can't.
Yeah.
And the arts, unfortunately, are some of the last to respond to things. Like when there's an economic crisis, like in 2008 when the market crashed, the arts are the last ones to respond. So the donors didn't come back until much later, until after the market recovered. And the
Sure.
same thing happens for us. There is going to be a point where we're going to be allowed to have large group gatherings again.
Hmm. Hmm.
However, is the public going to be comfortable
Sure.
coming back to concerts in an enclosed area? And so, it's interesting to see how things are responding so far. The two things that I've been noticing, the two articles that I saw that give hope are, Shanghai Disney opened up,
Yeah.
which is a huge location with a lot of packed people,
Sure. Sure.
and
Sure.
they sold out their capacity. They
Wow.
only did 30% capacity, but they sold out instantly. And the same thing happened for cruises, which are enclosed spaces too. And
Hmm.
then, as you know, with all the rioting going on and the demonstrations, I should say more appropriately, there are a lot of people that are gathering close together.
Yeah.
And so, I hope that the transition back to um, in a time when people are comfortable gathering in groups will be
Hmm.
short, and that likewise concerts will be able to do that. Most people think that a vaccine will need to be implemented before people are really comfortable going back.
Sure.
But as you know, and something that we always try to change too, but currently the demographics for classical music tend to be older
Hmm.
in the population, and that is the higher risk category of people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Most definitely. Well, that's interesting. You bring up, you know, this, I guess, adaptability that the music profession has to see. But in other words, in some ways, this is sort of like a wake up call, would you say, for music? Because, accessibility wise, we're more than accessible, right? With all this technology. Who knew maybe a year ago when we were in Napa, we'd be connecting like this, right? I should be coming to Napa right now, not
Yeah,
connecting in Zoom.
on a personal level, it's really funny because we've been looking for a violin teacher for my youngest
Sure.
daughter, and having trouble in our immediate area because it has to do with travel logistics
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
our timing schedules. And then we realized through Zoom and everybody's doing online lessons, suddenly the entire world is open.
Sure, sure.
Taking French lessons from somebody I think in Canada. They are doing violin lessons from people hours away.
Hmm.
And so there's a it just changes the way we're allowed to connect. I think the biggest thing is that it's hard for ensembles to congregate and rehearse because through Zoom and through technology there's always a little bit of a lag,
Yeah.
and so direction can go one way, but it's hard to have direct instantaneous feedback
Sure.
for performances.
Yeah.
So we can do these videos where we stitch together performances, which are a bit artificial, but they still give the impression of a collaboration ensemble. But the experience itself is actually harder to is something that's going to be missed for a while.
Definitely, definitely. But in another sense, this is some way like a wake up call to people, consumers, that we are we have the opportunity to change the narrative to we are essential. We are essential to the community. We are voices in the community, and our art and our music is vital to survival. Do you think musicians can slowly change, especially orchestras, can change the narrative? Oh, classical music, orchestra concerts, suit and tie, concert halls, no more stiffness. Like go from that concert hall setting where we are a luxury good to now serve this thing that people can need for
Yeah,
consumption.
definitely. I think there's a few things about that. One thing about Zoom and online resources and concerts or whatnot
Yeah.
is that you're really connecting to the people directly. And I
Sure.
think sometimes in a concert hall, there's this perception of that quote fourth wall that
Yeah.
says, the performers are on stage, they wear tuxedos or suits all day long,
Yeah.
they play their instruments all day long, which is true. But I mean, that
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's just akin to an elementary kid going to the supermarket and seeing their teacher there. They're like, "What? The teacher doesn't live at the school?" You know, Classical musicians are people that live in the communities in which we live, right?
Sure.
And the
Sure.
other thing about art being sort of essential to our being, in the Spanish flu and the pandemic in 1918, they kept the theaters open because they said, what good is it going to be if we lock down everything so that people don't even have the will to live anymore? And
Yeah.
they didn't have technology at that point, but they knew that the arts were essential. Art and music, especially music, is older than language. Cognitive
Sure.
thing,
Yeah.
and so it's just a part of evolutionarily. So it has such importance to who we are as human beings,
Hmm.
and now that we have all these like functional MRIs that can actually see what our brain is doing when we do things and we listen to music,
Hmm.
we realize all those things about music, feeding our souls, or is essential to who we are as human beings. But we can actually see why that's important, why that's possible, because it has such regulatory effects on us. It helps us connect to emotions and helps us to be able to exist through tragedies like this. It
Sure.
actually is even more important nowadays, and I think that there is, like you said, the accessibility on being able to connect to Yo-Yo Ma giving a free concert of
Yeah.
the
All 6 suites.
yeah, exactly, all 6 suites. And that was something that was given free. Or Berlin Philharmonic with the digital concert hall, you can access for at least for a month, like all their concerts, some
Yeah.
spectacular performances. And so I think that it's just there is the danger in that is that, like newspapers, the danger is figuring out how to go back to a system where you can support the careers of those musicians.
Sure.
You have Yo-Yo Ma giving you a free concert. What are you going to do about the local cellist that you have that's
Hmm.
also nearby, that also needs to survive?
Sure.
So I think there's a lot of benefit, but and there's a lot of issues to confront. But as everybody knows, it's just completely changed
Yeah.
how we go about accessing the arts.
Yeah, and let's go back to your career at the moment. Actually, with all these cancellations, what were some things you were looking forward to? Performance opportunities. I mean, I know from the Napa side, if Napa happened again, there was going to be some exciting stuff like Beethoven's Triple with Josh Bell and whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. Napa would have been happening in about a month.
Sure.
I would have just come back from Nashville Ballet, and they were going to be doing a fantastic work by Max Richter, the Four Seasons Reimagined, and it's a phenomenal work that I was really looking forward to.
Sure.
And the musicians who actually would have been on stage with the dancers. Um, San Francisco Ballet had Romeo and Juliet.
Uh huh.
Uh, that I've conducted with them a few times beforehand, and it's always like one of my favorite scores of all time.
Hmm.
And of course, there are things in the fall, and my chorus, they were doing the Bruckner Te Deum,
Hmm.
Arvo Pärt Te Deum, and just some really fantastic repertoire all along the way. In the fall, I was actually going to Germany to study with Kent Nagano. Um,
Wow.
in Germany and see a lot of the various houses there, because there's this question that I have about the traditions versus look at repertoire new, and
Hmm.
so I'm really interested right now in really knowing as much of the old traditions, especially in Germanic repertoire,
Hmm.
and then making your own viewpoints about what is things that you connect and what things that you don't. It's very much like now, like we're rethinking everything. So
Sure. 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 Definitely. Yeah. Definitely a time to reflect. Ming, you wear a lot of hats from what I've gathered. You're music director for this. You cover conductor for San Francisco. You're part of the ballet, and you do all this Napa stuff. How do you balance it all?
for me, that is the balance, because to me, like in college, for
Yeah.
some reason, most colleges distinguish between choral conducting, orchestral conducting, wind conducting, opera conducting, whatever.
Sure.
To me, conducting is conducting. Shostakovich, Tchaikovsky didn't write only symphonies. He didn't write only operas.
Yeah.
He didn't write only chamber music. And so it's important. Like, how do you, like Eugene Onegin of Tchaikovsky, he wrote that at the same time he almost committed suicide. Well, he tried to commit suicide. At the same time that he wrote the Fourth Symphony,
Sure.
right? And those two pieces inform each other. And
Hmm.
so if you know Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, but you don't know the opera, you don't know that scene where he talks about killing his best friend,
Sure.
Lenski, which was a direct relationship to his own life circumstance at the time.
Hmm.
What I mean, like, and how the oboe, the slow movement oboe solo talks about isolation, and is based off an old Russian song about the birch trees, and how birch trees represent innocence and its loss of innocence.
Yeah.
Like they all go together. And so in my career, I try to balance it all. I want to be involved in opera. I want to be involved in ballet. I want to be involved in symphonic. I love pops. I love education because I think education is nothing to do with only doing things towards kids. It's you want to get people excited about music at every age.
Sure.
And why not start it when they're younger too? But and the work that I do with Napa tends to be primarily administrative.
Sure.
But I almost view it as the same functions as a conductor does. What my goal is as a conductor is to allow the musicians to play at their best, to create the environment that they can create and
Definitely.
collectively come together. And the
Definitely.
same thing when you approach things administratively for music programs too, you want to create an environment where the musicians have the ability to do what they want to make music. And
Yeah.
for academic institutions, you want to create environments where young professionals can get the most out of the experience that they have.
For sure.
Right? So I like the variety that's there because working with dancers is thrilling. But again, when you do Tchaikovsky or when you do Prokofiev, let's say Romeo and Juliet,
Yeah.
in the symphony, and you are not connected to how the dancers feel and what they move, like what the genesis for this is. I mean, like it's I feel like there's an aspect of it that's missing. And so I think it just makes the entire experience richer. I mean, musicians are used to working with lots of different organizations.
Sure. Sure.
Like Michael Tilson Thomas is just retiring from San Francisco Symphony. He has his major institution with New World Symphony.
Yeah.
He still, I believe, was still principal conductor of London Symphony and obviously guest conducts quite a bit. And so for me, it's just more important, while I do have multiple organizations with whom I work, but that there's a variety in the genre that
Sure.
I'm in.
So essentially, all the hats you wear, they're just complementary of each other. Because I
Yeah.
think in my experience too, like especially with running a festival, when you sort of put yourself in the shoes of an administrator, you kind of see now the other side of not necessarily musicians complaining, but just sort of what musicians really want from a different level. Not necessarily just the artistic side.
And vice versa. I mean, like, it can feel very, if you're an operations manager and you're trying to do the setup and these musicians are complaining about the amount of space or where they're situated, it makes a huge difference if you have been in those seats and realize, yeah, you can't have horns sitting in front of trumpets because horns, with bells pointed backwards and trumpets forward, it's probably the worst possible place for both of them to go, to be.
Sure.
So you have an understanding of that. And likewise, as a musician, as being an administrator, and understanding the difficulties that organizations have, I think as a musician, you just want to collaborate with them more and say, how can I help the health of the organization?
Definitely.
I mean, like, one organization, I shouldn't name specifically because they're having significant financial difficulties, but, like that I'm involved in, was saying, like we're having a lot of difficulties. We don't know if we can do this or this and this, but having experience as an administrator, I can sit back and say, okay, I understand this approach to that type of concert would cost more, but if we tweak things where we can change a little bit of the repertoire, you can actually save a bit of money like this, or change the amount of rehearsal time. You have a little bit more understanding of the issues that the administration is going through, and I think that makes you a little bit more flexible and in collaborating to try to collaborate to.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. So Ming, I mean, all this passion and entrepreneurial drive. Let's dive right into it. How did it all start? What is your journey as a musician?
When I was young, apparently the story is that we went to some reception where there was a string quartet, and I apparently sat down and watched the string quartet for like 3 hours. But I think it was like 5 or 6. But my parents immediately knew that, music is really important. So music has always had some importance in my life. And when I got out of college, I got out of high school, I had the chance to either focus on chemistry and sciences or music. And one of my musical mentors at the time said, music is really one of these things that if you have a calling for, you should start early and see something you really connect to. And it turned out to be the best, decision, because that freshman year in college, I was part of a chorus that traveled around and toured as part of the program. And there was this one instance where it was like the 7th performance out of 12, same repertoire, every single concert. And we went to this Ukrainian church where they had this large audience there, which obviously had a lot of people from the church.
Yeah.
And this one Ukrainian folk song that was arranged in this really modern way. But it was the fact that all the audience actually knew the folk song from when they were children. And there
Wow.
was a moment where I realized that everybody in the performance, the audience, the performers, we on stage, and the conductor were so engaged in that performance. It was like this transformative moment. And
Hmm.
for me, that's actually what got me into conducting, because I realized that the conductor was a conduit for that. And
Sure.
for me, long gone are the days where conductors have been tyrants on the, imposing a musical idea on the podium, and much more nowadays, like Simon Rattle, especially. I mean, it's about, again, trying to create an environment where musicians can perform their best, and the conductor is a conduit and for that energy, but also focuses. So we're collectively creating musical vision that is cohesive
Sure.
together. And so conductors can get in the way, or can actually heighten the performance. And
Yeah.
our goal is to just try to the secret is that an orchestra can perform a piece most of the time without a conductor. Like 85% of the piece can do it without a conductor,
Yeah.
and the conductor can add 15% or can actually screw it up and make it
Yeah.
even worse.
Sure.
So I think that's how I got involved, and I got the bug for conducting. And music has always obviously been there from the beginning. So
Sure. But I mean, all your experiences, didn't you start off on piano, correct? It was piano studies first, right?
yeah, piano studies first, and violin afterwards. I sang a bit in chorus, did some of the all-state stuff, but piano was the primary instrument, and I used to. It's one of those things. At first, I didn't really connect to it. It's just a thing that you did as a kid. And then there's especially an Asian kid. Uh,
Weekly lessons.
yeah, exactly. And then, but the thing is that I remember specifically in sixth grade, there's this kid that played the third movement of the Patatik Sonata, which is like,
Hmm.
virtuosic and fun. And I immediately told like I didn't know the instrument can really, I didn't realize you could really do that. And so I told my parents I just wanted to play that. And from then on, I played, I think, like 3 hours a day, basically.
Wow.
So piano was a gateway for all of that. But the idea of collaboration, piano, even when you're in the orchestra,
Hmm.
you're sort of in the back, or it's a very solitary instrument.
Yeah.
And the benefit of piano is that you can play pieces just by yourself, complete full pieces with such richness and everything.
Sure.
But there's less of an opportunity for chamber music. The degree I got at Carnegie Mellon for grad school was conducting, because he felt that conductors should be able to work with any ensemble that you're put up with. You just need to understand how they work. So if you don't know how to work with singers, then you just learn how singers work, and you should just learn what the performers' difficulties and how they approach the music. So a brass player, having showing strength is the
Mhm.
worst like a gesture possible for singers, because
Sure.
if you show tightness, it just actually literally connects to the tightness in their throat. But
Yeah.
I think that those mentors, Frank Abrahams and Robert Page, really instilled this idea of music conducting being open to all genres, and then of course all the major musicians, Zdenek McCall, Kurt Mazur, all these major conductors,
Yeah.
Mazel, that came through and conducted.
For
So
sure. Wow. So, I mean, even now in all the things that you do, like for conducting and whatnot, are there any idols that you look up to right now in the conducting world after being involved with this sort of mentorship and being a student conducting? And now do you sort of see like this, wow, I just love the way, Yannick conducts. I love MTT. Like, I love how this and that. Like,
yeah,
have like a new set of eyes for conductors now kind of thing?
yeah, all the time. I think that like everything, music you can never learn enough from,
Sure.
and you can learn both ways. It doesn't have to be from the mentors. It can be from students. You learn from teaching. You learn from being taught, and it's just a continual cycle. One of my favorite things about working with children specifically is that the excitement they get over Xenakis and Beethoven and pop music.
Yeah.
They have literally no preference. And just like kids, when they fall and they get a little bit hurt, they look to parents to see, is this something I should be really worried about? And if you just go to them, oh my God, you fell down, oh look, let's continue playing, then they're
Mhm.
not going to be worried about it. The same thing, like kids literally have no preference in terms of musical style. So
Yeah.
if you have fun playing Beethoven, they're going to love Beethoven. My father and I grew up on Bach, and
Yeah.
so Bach is one of my favorite composers because of that, because it had an emotional connection.
Sure.
Like you know, I when I conducted in Russia for the first time, it was with an orchestra, the Bolshoi Orchestra, and it was one of the most transformative musical experiences for me, in like one of these famous orchestras. But the way we were doing Shostakovich the second piano concerto, which he wrote for his son, and the second movement of it just has piano at the beginning. It starts off with very dark and slow string playing, and it just has piano, which is not the softest dynamic, and
Yeah.
especially for Shostakovich. But they played with such a timbre, like they just barely had any pressure on their bows to make this ghostly, breathy sound. But they
Yeah.
all played it in exactly the same way, and so you just got this wave of sound that was just like eerily like reminiscent of like this. You could tell it's like the repression of the Russian culture for years and centuries, like all within that. And it was transformative because I was like, that's what Shostakovich really is.
Yeah.
And like every single orchestra you learn from, like they all have different approaches. They have different styles. And every single person that you come across, the things that you read, I think you just like they say about musicians and conductors and everybody, it's just like the more you experience, the more you learn constantly, the
Hmm.
more rounded you are, and you can
Definitely.
take from all those experiences. Um,
Wow.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah. No, that sounds like that's actually what I would say is a very interesting, unique story that you wouldn't hear most of the time. Because most of the time, especially on these kind of conversation series that I've heard from musicians, they always talk about, oh, like those musical experiences that changed my life is the superstars, Yo-Yo Ma, Perlman. Those are the kind of people. But you just mentioned like a very niche and unique experience that really just, I guess, transformed the way you view your own artistry, right? Would you say?
yeah, and like I mentioned, like my plan was, and hopefully I can still do that, is to study with Ken Nagano to study Germanic traditions and their
Sure.
qualities to music. And that is just one area of just continually trying to figure out why those traditions are in place. The
Yeah.
very first time I did um, Lucia di Lammermoor, Donizetti opera,
Uh huh.
was the bel canto tradition where they have a lot of layers of traditions, right? And the first time I listened to it with a score, there's this one scene in the mad scene where I'm like, did I miss something? Is this score wrong? It's like 5 minutes of improvised cadenzas for the soprano and a flute, right?
Wow.
And over the years, sopranos have changed some of the traditions. Some of them completely threw it away. Some of them added to it. But you can actually see the history of this cadenza getting longer and longer, and sopranos adding to it and saying, I can't do that very well, but I do this really well, so I want to change it like this. But like knowing those traditions and knowing why they're in place
Hmm.
gives you the ability to go back to the literature and say, you know what, that's actually a really silly tradition because that was only done because that theater didn't have the ability to do a scene change there, so they just cut that scene, but it has no musical or theatrical reason, right? Or this cadenza or this sort of cut was done because that soprano just happened to not be able to do that line very well, so they
Hmm.
cut it. But if you can do it well, there's no reason to cut it. Or this cut is fantastic because the scene is very really long. You actually need to trim it a bit to give it a little bit more dramatic impact.
Right.
And so I think really understanding where the traditions come from, what the musical rationale or dramatic rationale is for those traditions, right? Mazel was conducting Brahms One, Symphony Number One, with New York Philharmonic.
Yeah.
He became the new music director this a while ago, obviously, and after Mazur actually. And there is one place where no, sorry, Brahms Four, where the first entrance of the oboe comes in and clashes with the rest of the orchestra. It's this beautiful little suspension,
Hmm.
and the oboe player said, "We're taking time here. Why are we taking time? Can you explain to me why?"
Hmm.
And it wasn't an antagonistic question, but I mean, like like some of those questions are driven from if you tell me the rationale, the musical idea for what we're going for, then it'll give a better idea for what context I'm supposed to be creating the phrase.
Sure. Sure.
Bell said, "Well, because I felt like it." Right? Nova player was like, "That's not good enough. That's not good enough. I need to know why. Like I need to know why." And they had this little moment, but it's really funny because most of us would see that as Mazel trying to be egotistical or this oboe player trying to be cantankerous.
Sure.
But
Sure.
like, as a performer, you say, you know what? They need to know why they're slowing down. Are they just going to make up their own like blossom on that note? Are they going to pull back a little bit more or taper off even more, how are they going to musically approach it? And if you have an idea of what the musical idea is behind that,
Yeah.
then it just allows everybody to feel more comfortable, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think traditions are important, but like again, the underlying reason for the traditions. So
Wow. So essentially, as a conductor, in some ways, when you're score studying, creating this ambiance for the orchestra, you kind of put yourself in the shoes of the composer themselves, right? Would you say for every?
yeah, oh definitely. And then like it's like the more you know of a composer, the more context you have for where pieces lie in
Mhm.
their careers. Like Chopin, when he was sorry, excuse me, first starting out, his first few piano pieces are ridiculously virtuosic. They're like ridiculous. And some of the ballades, the mazurkas, some can be a little bit less challenging technically. Well, the ballades are actually really challenging technically, but I mean some of the mazurkas and the dances are not
Yeah.
as challenging technically. But you realize when he was young, he was this brash composer. But I mean, like if you see them without context of where they were in his career, you just be like, oh, he kind of wrote some fireworks, but not knowing that like he was trying to make a name for himself. He was trying to be known.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
And then like the same thing with Brahms, and like his first symphony, scared to death to be named Beethoven's successor.
Yeah.
That his first symphony would be compared to one of his greatest idols of all time. Waited until he was 40 years old to compose his first symphony after he felt like he finally could master compositional process or orchestration enough to create a symphony. And so, like you can feel, and then within like the next 10 years, composed all four of his symphonies quickly. But I mean, like, you could, knowing that and the struggles that he has, that gives a lot more context to the works than just looking at you. In conducting, there's this when they tell students, they say you should never listen to recordings
Hmm.
because it's just going to give you a viewpoint without allowing you to develop your own ideas.
Sure.
For me, it's actually kind of mixed because I do want to come with my own ideas, but I also want to hear what Bernstein hears in Brahms.
Yeah.
I want to hear what Savalas hears in Brahms. I want to hear what Karajan hears in
Yeah.
Brahms, and
Definitely.
what they hear and what they bring out. And so, if it replaces your own musical thoughts, that's one thing.
Sure.
But it also is almost like a masterclass of like when you listen to Rachmaninoff play his own piano works, and you realize that's how much rubato
Hmm.
those works are supposed to have.
Yeah.
It's like a whole masterclass on how long you can stretch phrases, or that you realize that Liszt's works or Paganini, I mean Liszt works, I'll say as a pianist, are meant to have your artistic voice of the performer on top of that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Like we're saying with bel canto, you are meant to cut and paste that piece, that opera, to accommodate your strengths as a performer,
Hmm.
right? And so, like if you don't know that, then I mean, like it's hard to. I think it's just I think as much as you can to absorb the ideas and hear what other people are saying, it just makes you a more well-rounded musician.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, and you mentioned this well-rounded musician, which also, I guess, leads me to my next topic. You as an entrepreneur, like what drives you in that regard? Because you're heavily involved with Napa, and I guess we can talk about your journey to that. But just like the outside, off the stage kind of thing. It seems like you like to sort of fit the pieces of the puzzle with music and other professions, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, like I love all of it. I mean, like I think first of all, I think it's important for us always to be reinventing ourselves, just like we were talking about at the very opening of this.
Mhm.
Like this is an opportunity for us actually to really rethink how we connect with people, right?
Yeah.
The issue is that classical music, especially, comes with some of its traditions, which can be off-putting to some people, right?
For
And
sure.
we're all in music because we connected to music, but like I was mentioning earlier, there is no person on earth right now that has not had some connection to music.
Hmm.
Music has such importance to all of our lives, whether it's pop, classical, jazz, whatever. But like there's a reason why mothers sing to babies, instead of just talking. I mean, like singing has extra importance to us. I can remember specifically, like being in the summer in a convertible with blasting music and the music that I was listening to at the time. I mean, I can remember obviously like so many classical music moments that are so powerful, and music has such direct connection to us. And
Hmm.
classical music especially has the widest range of human emotion. It's some of the most powerful music. And so when you bring people into classical music, in a way that they don't feel intimidated about the experience, feeling like they don't know when to clap, or they're not wearing the right thing, or that there are people that, like, there are pieces that they're not going to connect to because they don't know the history of it. You
Yeah.
know, if you remove all those inhibitions and those barriers to connecting with the music, you find that people just love the music. There are people, you know, like maybe Mozart's not your thing, maybe, you know, uh, um, um, like I said, like Xenakis or Adams is your thing. You know, I mean, like there is so much in classical music that there is definitely ways to connect to audiences that have been turned off to music before. And I feel
Sure.
like we need to constantly try to figure out new ways to connect to those people, because there's always new generations that are interested in classical music. I mean, like just the fact that Yo-Yo Ma was doing the concerts for free. You know, there are people that are going to be accessing Yo-Yo Ma for the first time because they didn't have to drive somewhere, they didn't have to pay something,
Sure.
and it's their gateway into, you know, classical music. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. Most definitely. Most definitely. And I mean, I guess in that sense, are there any creative projects that you would want to attempt with sort of music and entrepreneurship?
I like senses. You know, like I love cognitive science, and so, you know, anything that connects those things together. I mean, I mean, like, especially with Napa. You know, I mean, when you have the head sommelier of the French Laundry, who loves former head sommelier for the French Laundry, Dennis Kelly, who loves classical music beyond belief, and his daughter's a pianist and everything. You have him talking about wine, and you're like, you know, that's so funny because we talk about Mozart being like that, like refinement and structure and classically driven, you know, not phrases, but I mean classically driven like expressions of fruit. You know,
Yeah.
you know, like there are ways to connect that, and you know, wine is also one of those things that, and food sometimes too, where people can feel off put by not knowing enough. But I mean, like I like those sensory mixing up those experiences together, and also, I mean, like I do feel like a lot of the changes of venue
Hmm.
um, make a big difference, but I think that is only a tool, and it has to be on how you approach talking to the audience. You know, like I think it needs to be, for me, it needs to be more driven by how we connect to shared human experiences, like emotions, like the fact that Tchaikovsky was so depressed, or that he was closeted and couldn't, you know, feel free. Like he had a fake marriage that obviously went into depression because it failed and he couldn't hide who he was. You know, or the fact that Mozart, you know, couldn't live up to the expectations of his father. I mean, you know, like, and the music that he wrote in minor oftentimes expressed the truest, deepest emotions, like when his mother passed away and he wrote the A minor piano sonata with the
Hmm.
pounding chords. Dun, 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 dun. I mean, like, or obviously the Requiem, which you almost feel like he wrote for himself. You know, I think that if you connect to the emotional backgrounds of these pieces, like the Dvorak Stabat Mater, which he wrote after he lost all three of his kids in the span of a few months, you know, young kids.
Hmm.
You know, I mean, like that it had direct personal experience to him. Then those are ways to connect to people instead of saying, you know, Brahms' Fourth Symphony, which is one of the most emotional and beautiful pieces. Well, it's a rondo sonata allegro form, and you know, the recapitulation, it happens to slow down the tempo to like twice the like twice slower than the exposition of the main theme to highlight it. And people are like, yeah, but what does that mean to me, right?
Hmm.
And you should be talking about like, you know, like Brahms is so brilliant. I mean, like if you want to talk to technical aspects, Brahms like avoided the 5/1 cadences that we hear in Beethoven all the time, and he used these thirds, and you can hear it in the beginning of the fourth symphony. Ba da 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 da.
Yeah.
All it is thirds, right? And if you put it out with excitement, then people are like, even if it's the first time hearing triads, you know, or median relationships or whatever, if you hear it with excitement and why it's powerful and exciting, you know, to hear this music and the poignancy of that first note hung on before the rest of the orchestra comes, you know, that B, you know, like then people get really, I think, connected to the music in a
Sure.
way that doesn't feel like they're being lectured to,
Hmm.
or that they need to have background information to appreciate, you know.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, that's interesting. You bring up this. Do you think as musicians, in some ways, besides performing at a very high level and just sort of, I guess, you know, collaborating with others and whatnot, there's a, sort of like a social responsibility. It's our duty to sort of turn these forms of art and really boil it down to just language. Like, how can we just communicate with audience, right?
Yeah,
Because you can perform really, really well, and you can just sort of, you know, you can play the greatest Tchaikovsky violin concerto ever, but to someone who doesn't know anything, who's just sitting there.
Yeah, I mean, like, but it's just, I think it's the way it's approached. I mean, like, like Beethoven's Third Symphony. Everybody talks about how that's heralds the new romantic like era of classical music and transformative movement. But nobody talk, and they say, it's a personal expression of him because he was also wrote the Heilige Stadt, Testament, where he talks about losing his hearing, and you can, it's an important piece to him. But they don't talk about what in the music actually reflects that.
Sure.
I mean, like, they don't talk about the fact that, he expanded the form so much that people found it difficult to listen to. They're like, this symphony is so ridiculously long. Am I supposed to sit here for this? The fact that, the very last movement, is based off of, like, has this, has this fantastically dramatic entrance, and then has this almost silly theme of the strings playing pizzicato where they barely play any melody. It's like a skeleton of a theme. And it happens to be the skeleton of the entire symphony based off of that little pizzicato section in the fourth movement, which sounds so ridiculously silly. But when you take it to the bare bones, you're like, oh my gosh, he really did compose this entire work, or the first time ever in a symphony that there was a funeral march.
Sure.
Right. And, and then if you think about Beethoven thinking about the loss of his hearing and how tragic it was for him, and you hear the funeral march from that aspect, then that's it takes on a different meaning. And then you're not trapped so much about, oh my God, the length of it, or the fact that, like, again, that there's 10 variations in the last movement of the third symphony, of the third symphony. And each one builds another layer to it. And that is based off of his Prometheus, ballet, talking about the creation of man and, the Napoleon, all the stories about it. It's if you talk about the work and what makes the work powerful, then I think that you can talk about specific technical parts of the work that make it really moving, right? And make it one of these war horses. Not just the fact that it starts with two exciting chords that scares everybody in their seats, I think that, or do some historical thing where it's just like, it's important because it's historic, or he crossed out Napoleon's name on it. You're just like, but why? Why does this symphony elevate the idea of humans and like individualism, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow. So I mean, Ming, let's slowly wrap things up. But basically, you've had this accomplished career, and you juggle all of this on top of having a family and whatnot. But what's next for you? I mean, you wear all these hats. It seems like one would say as a conductor, you're. I wouldn't say this is it and this is okay and you're just gonna ride in the sunset kind of thing. But what's next for you? What are your big ambitions?
I think that obviously the next step is just to pivot and figure out how these organizations function for the next at least 12 months, right? Yeah. Because we don't know what that progression is, and almost every single week things change.
Sure.
Every day feels like a month right now.
Sure.
After that, I think there's going to be a lot of rethinking into the industry, and we're going to see how that changed thinking is created things that might die off and we might go back to old traditions, or might permanently change how we access the arts, how we view the arts, how we experience the arts. For me personally, I am on this quest to really try to figure out, again, these old traditions within musical ideas. Like I remember talking to Raymond Lissy, who's the principal second for Vienna Philharmonic, and I asked him to do a workshop once, and on the Viennese approach to Beethoven and Mozart, and Beethoven, Mozart, long connection to Vienna, obviously, and Vienna Philharmonic, the foremost, authority on Viennese traditions. And he said, "What do you mean? What's the Viennese tradition?" And I'm like, "Well, like the Viennese approach to Mozart and Beethoven." And he's like, "What do you mean? There's only one approach to Mozart and Beethoven. That's it. There's one approach." If you just like, but that's the approach. That's how you play Mozart and Beethoven. There's no other way,
Sure.
Like they have a series of traditions. La Scala is one of the last opera houses in the world where audiences still boo, because if you break certain traditions, they will boo you, and you have to know them. And so I'm on this quest to personally just to to continue to learn all the traditions and see how they contribute to the musical phrasing, and to know the composers more through that. You know, like the Italians will have tons of rubato, but French never do a lot of rubato unless it's stated in the score. They try to do things in phrasing with dynamics, right? Or I remember one year, Stéphane Deneuve, who was principal conductor of Philadelphia, came, and he was doing Siegfried Dell with Napa, right?
Uh-huh.
And he was conducting, and the first violins have ba-da, ya-da-da-da, but they have just an octave, and they have it held B for a long time. And he's like, no, you don't understand. Wagner is of the German tradition. There is always a pulse under Wagner, even if it's a sustained single note, because you have to portray to the other musicians and the audience that there is a pulse under that single note. And everybody's sitting there like,
What?
I'm not gonna pulse a note. Like, what? How can you do it? And he's like, but it has to do with how you approach your vibrato, how the note blossoms and blooms, how, like, you know, like the dynamic of the progression of the note, you know, how you warm the note over the time, and that will give these the word he used was micro nuances, which affected me so greatly. These micro nuances of these little rubato, these little changes of dynamic that will completely change a piece if it sounds Italian, German, French, you know, Asian. I mean, like, just all these little things. And you have to be aware of those things to be able to, you know, to approach the music in that way. And it was again one of these life transforming moments, you know, again from one of the, you know, like sort of a mentor like figure, but I mean, like, you know, like from this guy who's just like, yeah, those micro nuances. So that's what my personal goal is. Figure out what the industry is going and try to adapt with the industry, hopefully provide new ideas for the industry as well, participate in it, but also on a personal exploration, continue, again, develop my own ideas, but also trying to really understand on a really deep level where these traditions come from, and hopefully come together to try to decide which ones I feel are more important and relevant, and ones that are there for tradition's sake, you know.
Wow. So it seems like what really drives you and keeps you motivated is simply this never-ending pursuit of music, this curiosity, right? Would you say? Like, that's the fuel.
Exactly.
So I guess this is the last question I want to ask, because I always stump people with this, but you know, you've had you wear multiple hats, you conduct, like you said, you just look at conducting as conducting, orchestra, dance, ballet, whatever, opera. I like to think musicians are very similar to athletes. So if you were playing, or if you were conducting your final concert of your career, the moment before you're hanging up your cleats, what are you going to program?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it would have to be, you know, it's funny because I was thinking about this the other day. Romeo and Juliet, the last scene, because the music that he wrote, Romeo and Juliet, was by Prokofiev.
Yeah.
Prokofiev was a Christian scientist, so he didn't believe in the idea of death, right? And so when Romeo and Juliet die at the end, that's not a tragic thing, right? It's not a tragic thing at all. I mean, like, so why would it be a tragic thing? So he actually rewrote the ending of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet in his music so that they both live at the end, right? And Stalin, when they saw the premiere of this, was like, "You are not changing Shakespeare." Right?
Yeah.
And so he changed it, and now we have one of the most tragic scenes of Romeo and Juliet. But the bizarre part was the music of Juliet's death, and the most tragic music, which is in C major, was actually the same music of this relief of being both alive, you know. And it served the same function somehow with the music and how it was approached. And so it's this almost amazing work, I think, that just is so sublime and gorgeous, but also has this such beauty to it, that just, and peace to it, that I think that it would be a wonderful, like, last work, especially because it's one of the works that, as many classical music concerts that end softly do, you
Sure.
know, there's a pause where the audience hesitates to let the music settle before acknowledging the performance.
Mm-hmm.
And so that moment, I think, you know, like, as I mentioned before, where hopefully the entire audience is engaged in that moment of silence and reverberation, not
Mhm.
only of sound but also for them personally. I think would be a nice way. Like the final notes would be those would be nice final notes. Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, I can definitely agree. I think musicians don't realize, our audience members don't realize, silence really contributes to a concert experience. Like it's
Yeah.
part of the music, really. It's like
Yeah.
we look at the fermata as like, okay, we're resting, but in reality, it creates like this ambiance, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Definitely. Okay, well, Ming, I mean, this has been an awesome conversation. It's always great to talk with you and catch up, and I'm so bummed I'm not coming back to Napa this summer, but I'm sure we'll cross paths again soon. And for those of you tuning in, listening, and viewing, we hope you like what you see. And Ming is obviously a great storyteller, but we're gonna have more artists just like Ming. And yeah, we hope you like and subscribe Broadcast Hawaii. Ming, is there any final thoughts you wanna say or?
No, it's great to see you in face to face, and hopefully look forward to seeing you in person sometime. And then the final thought that I would say actually is that artists are members of your community,
Yeah.
and just we want to all support our community around. Look for those artists, and if there are ways to support them, try to do so. So
Absolutely. Well, Ming, we'll definitely bring you out to Hawaii sometime. Hopefully, we can get you some conducting going.
sounds great.
All right,
Okay.
man. Take care.